The storm rolled across Manhattan's skyline, lightning flashes illuminating the glass walls of Calvin Moretti's penthouse. A self-made millionaire at 38, Calvin exuded charm and power. His chiseled jawline, always shadowed with a day's stubble, and piercing blue eyes commanded respect. Yet, beneath his suave exterior was a man as calculating as the algorithms he built in his early tech startup days. The world adored him, feared him, envied him, but no one truly knew him. That evening, Calvin hosted one of his legendary poker nights. The room brimmed with laughter, the clinking of whiskey glasses, and the faint shuffle of cards. His guests were the city's elite, CEOs, actors, and socialites, but Calvin always kept his distance, observing rather than fully engaging. His wealth had taught him a crucial lesson: trust no one. It was during the third hand of the night that his longtime rival, Eric Khloe, smirked from across the table. "You've got a good poker face, Moretti, but I bet you wouldn't take a real gamble." The room hushed, anticipation thick in the air. Calvin leaned back in his chair, his fingers lazily twirling a crystal tumbler. "Define real." Eric's smirk widened. "A wager that tests more than your bankroll. Something personal. Something unforgettable." Curiosity flickered in Calvin's eyes. "Go on." Eric leaned in, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "Marry someone outside your world. Someone who doesn't fit your image, a wild card. I'll even find her." Laughter erupted around the table, but Calvin's gaze didn't waver. He had built his empire by taking risks, thriving on challenges others deemed impossible. "You're serious?" Calvin asked, his tone half amused, half incredulous. "Completely," Eric replied, a gleam of mischief in his eyes. "We both know you live in a bubble of perfection. Let's see how adaptable you really are." The whiskey burned Calvin's throat as he swallowed the last of it. He set the glass down with a decisive clink. "What's the prize if I win?" Eric's grin turned sly. "You already know what's at stake, your reputation. But if you pull it off for a year, I'll sign over my share of the Zenith Towers project." Calvin's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile. Zenith Towers was a billion-dollar venture. Winning it would solidify his legacy. "Deal." The two men shook hands as the room erupted in applause and cheers. Little did anyone know, the stakes would spiral far beyond Calvin's wealth. The following week, Calvin received a message from Eric with a name and address: Khloe Daniels. 30 years old. A librarian. Eric's description ended with a single, pointed sentence: "She's the opposite of everything you value." When Calvin's sleek black car pulled up to the modest brownstone in Brooklyn, he paused, studying the neighborhood. It was quaint, quiet, and far from his world of high-rise skylines and designer interiors. He knocked twice, and the door creaked open, revealing Khloe. She was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. Her round frame was draped in a loose sweater, her curls untamed, and her glasses perched on her nose. Yet, her eyes, warm, honeyed brown, held a quiet intelligence that made him hesitate. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. Calvin cleared his throat, realizing he had been staring. "I'm Calvin Moretti. May I come in?" Khloe raised an eyebrow. "That depends. Are you selling something?" He chuckled, a sound more genuine than he expected. "Not exactly." Reluctantly, she opened the door, leading him into a small but cozy living room, books stacked in every corner. She sat, gesturing for him to do the same. "I'll get straight to the point," Calvin began. "I want to propose an arrangement. 1 year of marriage. I'll compensate you generously." Khloe blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, what?" Calvin sighed, the weight of his gamble suddenly more palpable. "Hear me out. You'll be financially set for life. I'll ensure your library receives funding for any project you dream of. All I need is your cooperation." Her laughter was soft but incredulous. You think you can just buy me? I think I'm offering you an opportunity, he countered, his voice measured. One that could change your life. Khloe tilted her head, scrutinizing him. Why me? Let's call it an experiment, Calvin replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. A study in opposites. For a long moment, she didn't respond, the only sound the rain pattering against the window. Then she leaned back, crossing her arms. If I agree, I have conditions. His interest piqued, Calvin leaned forward. I'm listening. 1. You fund a literacy program for underprivileged kids in the city. 2. We keep this, whatever it is, completely honest. No lies, no tricks. And 3. You respect my boundaries. A small smile played on Calvin's lips. Deal. As they shook hands, Khloe couldn't shake the feeling she was stepping into a storm she didn't fully understand. And for the first time in his carefully curated life, Calvin felt the faintest crack in his armor, as if Khloe's quiet defiance had unearthed something he hadn't realized was buried. By the end of that week, headlines screamed with news of Calvin Moretti's whirlwind engagement to an ordinary woman. The media frenzy was relentless, speculating on every possible motive. Yet, neither Calvin nor Khloe offered a single comment. In the confines of Calvin's world, Khloe navigated the labyrinth of wealth and power with unexpected grace. And in her modest world, Calvin discovered corners of humanity he had long since forgotten existed. But as they adjusted to their roles, neither anticipated the secrets and stars their charade would unearth. For this was not just a gamble on love or money, it was a wager that could unravel them both. Khloe Daniels felt as though she'd been swept into a hurricane, its winds carrying her far from her life in Brooklyn and depositing her in a world of opulence that she could barely comprehend. A week after agreeing to Calvin Moretti's outrageous proposal, she stood in the marble-floored entryway of his penthouse, feeling as small as an ant in a glass kingdom. The space was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Manhattan skyline, art pieces that seemed too priceless to touch, and a fireplace that crackled beneath a modern mantelpiece adorned with abstract sculptures. Yet for all its splendor, the penthouse felt cold, more like a gallery than a home. Calvin stood by the window, the evening city lights reflecting in his blue eyes. His tailored suit fit him as though sculpted to his body. He was the picture of effortless sophistication. This is your home now, he said, gesturing to the sprawling space. Khloe crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. You make it sound like a prison sentence. Calvin chuckled, a sound low and rich. That depends on your perspective. Before she could respond, his assistant, a young, sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa, approached with a clipboard in hand. Miss Daniels, I've scheduled fittings for tomorrow morning. Your public debut as Mrs. Moretti will be at the gala next Friday. Mr. Moretti insists you look the part. Khloe blinked. The part? What exactly is that? Vanessa raised an eyebrow, unamused. Elegant. Refined. Flawless. Calvin interjected, his tone smooth. Vanessa, why don't you give us a moment? With a tight nod, Vanessa left the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Khloe turned to Calvin, her frustration barely contained. So this is it. You're turning me into some Stepford wife to parade around your world. Calvin smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. I didn't think you'd need my help to adapt, but appearances matter here, Khloe. This is about more than just us. She stepped closer, her finger jabbing toward him. Don't think for a second you can mold me into someone I'm not. I agreed to this farce, but I won't become your project. For the first time, Calvin's polished demeanor cracked, his jaw tightening. And don't think for a second that stepping into my world doesn't come with rules. He wanted honesty. This is it. The room fell into a charged silence, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Khloe finally broke the tension with a resigned sigh. Fine. But don't expect me to stay quiet when I see something I don't like. A faint smile tugged at Calvin's lips. I wouldn't dream of it. The next few days were a whirlwind. Khloe found herself ushered into exclusive boutiques where designers fussed over her every movement. They measured, fitted, and styled her into creations she would have never dared to dream about. Despite her protests, Calvin had sent Vanessa ahead with his black card, sparing no expense. By the end of the week, Khloe barely recognized herself. Her reflection in the mirror revealed a woman draped in emerald silk, her hair styled into an elegant updo, and her lips painted a shade of red that screamed confidence. Yet as she stared into her own eyes, she wondered who this version of her really was. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of pomp and circumstance Khloe had only seen in movies. Calvin's limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of a historic Manhattan venue, its gilded doors framed by spotlights. A red carpet stretched before them, teeming with photographers whose cameras flashed like 1,000 tiny fireworks. Calvin stepped out first, exuding an effortless charm that seemed to command the attention of everyone around him. When he offered Khloe his hand, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. The crowd gasped as she emerged, the cameras swiveling to capture her transformation. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Who is she? Is that his fiancée? She's different. Different was putting it kindly. Khloe wasn't the statuesque, polished trophy wife they had expected. But there was an authenticity to her that caught even the most skeptical off guard. Calvin leaned close, his voice a murmur meant only for her. Smile. They're already judging you. Khloe shot him a pointed look but forced a small smile, her heart pounding. She hated every second of this. She wasn't here to entertain these people's expectations, or Calvin's. Inside the ballroom, Khloe was greeted with a cascade of chandeliers and an ocean of designer gowns. Calvin introduced her to a slew of names she couldn't keep track of, executives, celebrities, socialites. Each one offered her a look that ranged from polite curiosity to thinly veiled disdain. But none cut deeper than the interaction with Elena Hastings. Elena, an elegant blonde in a shimmering gold dress, sauntered over with the air of someone who belonged in every room she entered. She placed a hand on Calvin's arm, her red nails gleaming under the light. Calvin, she purred, her gaze briefly flickering to Khloe. I didn't think you'd bring a date. Khloe felt an immediate sting, but before she could respond, Calvin's tone turned sharp. My fiancée, Khloe Daniels. Khloe, this is Elena Hastings. The word fiancé hung in the air, drawing a flicker of surprise, and something darker, across Elena's face. How unexpected, Elena said, her smile icy. She turned to Khloe, her voice dripping with insincerity. You must be so overwhelmed by all of this. It's quite a leap from whatever it is you do. Khloe's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. She met Elena's gaze with calm resolve. Actually, I find it refreshing. Your world must be exhausting, with all the fake smiles and rehearsed lines. The jab was subtle but effective. Calvin's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Elena's expression froze for a split second before she recovered, her laugh tinkling like brittle glass. Calvin placed a hand on Khloe's back, guiding her away. Well played, he murmured under his breath. Don't get used to it, she replied, her voice low. As the night wore on, Khloe found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the facade of it all, the endless flattery, the subtle power plays, the constant undercurrent of judgment. By the time they returned to the penthouse, she was ready to collapse. She kicked off her heels and sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Calvin watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. You handled yourself well, he said finally. Khloe looked up, her glare sharp. I'm not a puppet for you to parade around, Calvin. These people, their world, it's not me. He nodded slowly, pouring himself a drink. You're right. It's not. But you survived it. And whether you like it or not, that matters. She leaned back, exhaustion seeping into her bones. I just want this year to be over. Calvin's smirk faded, replaced by something almost vulnerable. And I wonder if you'll feel the same by the end of it. For a moment, their eyes met, and Khloe saw something in him she couldn't quite name, something hidden beneath the layers of wealth and control. And for the first time, she realized she might not be the only one playing a part in this charade. 2 months into their unconventional arrangement, Khloe Daniels found herself slipping deeper into a life she had never envisioned. The contract was clear. She and Calvin were to present themselves as the perfect couple for a year, and in return, her library received transformative funding, along with a personal stipend that erased her financial worries. But beneath the surface of gala appearances, staged photo ops, and carefully curated social media posts, the cracks in their facade began to show. The wedding itself was as grand as it was surreal. Held in a cathedral that looked like it belonged in a European fairy tale, the ceremony was an event for the ages. Khloe had expected an intimate, rushed affair to fulfill their agreement, but Calvin had insisted on an extravagant display, ensuring it would dominate the headlines for weeks. This isn't just a wedding, Calvin had said during one of their curt planning sessions. It's a business strategy. It's about optics, Khloe. The world needs to believe this is real. Khloe had rolled her eyes. It's not real. It needs to look real, he had countered, his tone firm. On the day of the ceremony, Khloe stood in a gown that could have paid off her student loans 10 times over. The dress hugged her in all the right places, its intricate lace and beadwork glinting under the cathedral's towering stained glass windows. As she walked down the aisle, arm linked with a stand-in father figure, a retired actor Calvin had hired, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. Reporters and celebrities filled the pews, their whispers blending into the soaring notes of the organ. At the altar, Calvin waited, his expression unreadable. He wore a tailored black tuxedo, every inch of him exuding control and power. When their eyes met, Khloe felt a strange flicker of nerves. She had steeled herself for this moment, reminding herself that it was all a charade. Yet, as Calvin offered her his hand, there was an intensity in his gaze that unsettled her. You clean up well, he murmured as she reached him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You too, she replied, managing a small smile despite the weight of the moment. The ceremony passed in a blur. They recited their vows with precision, exchanged rings with practiced ease, and sealed the deal with a chaste kiss that sent the crowd into applause. Khloe felt her cheeks flush, not from affection, but from the surreal absurdity of the situation. As they exited the cathedral to a flurry of camera flashes, Calvin leaned close, his voice low. Smile, Mrs. Moretti. The world's watching. The honeymoon was a masterstroke of Calvin's genius, or cruelty, depending on how Khloe viewed it. Instead of a romantic getaway to the Maldives or the French Riviera, Calvin planned a week-long stay at one of his lesser-known properties, a sprawling, minimalist villa in the Rocky Mountains. Isolated, quiet, and far removed from the media's prying eyes, it offered them a rare reprieve. On the first evening, Khloe sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping hot tea and watching the snow fall. Calvin was on a call in the adjacent room, pacing as he discussed business deals she didn't understand. When he finally joined her, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, she broke the silence. Do you ever stop working? He smirked, settling into the chair across from her. Do you? Touché. She looked back at the snow, the tension between them oddly companionable. So, what's your plan when all this is over? Find someone who fits your world better. Calvin's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't read. And what about you? What happens when you're back in Brooklyn? Khloe shrugged. I go back to my library. My normal life. His gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, she thought he might say something profound. But he simply sipped his whiskey, retreating behind the walls he had so carefully built. As the weeks turned into months, Khloe began to see beyond Calvin's polished exterior. She witnessed the sleepless nights he spent orchestrating deals that kept his empire afloat, the rare moments when his mask slipped, revealing a man weighed down by expectations and loneliness. But she also saw his cruelty, the sharp edge of his tongue when he was frustrated, the way he manipulated people like pawns on a chessboard. One evening, after yet another tense dinner with one of Calvin's business partners and their insufferable spouses, Khloe couldn't hold back any longer. "You're exhausting, you know that," she said as they entered the penthouse. Calvin raised an eyebrow, loosening his tie. "Do tell. You treat everyone like they're expendable," she snapped, kicking off her heels. "Like they're just tools for your convenience. Do you even like anyone?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I don't have the luxury of liking or disliking, Khloe. My world doesn't run on emotions. It runs on results." Her eyes narrowed. "And what about this?" She gestured between them. "Is this just another result to you?" For the first time, Calvin looked caught off guard. He opened his mouth to reply but hesitated, as if weighing his words. "It's complicated," he said finally. Khloe scoffed. "That's not an answer." "You want an answer," he said, his voice rising. "Fine. Yes, this started as a game. A bet. But it's not that simple anymore." Her breath caught. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means, you're not who I thought you'd be. And maybe I'm not who you think I am." The room fell into silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Khloe didn't know what to say, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to ask. In the months that followed, their dynamic shifted. The public saw them as the perfect couple, smiling at events, walking arm in arm through the streets of Manhattan. But behind closed doors, their relationship became something far more complex. Khloe saw glimpses of Calvin's vulnerability, the cracks in his armor that hinted at a man longing for something he couldn't name. And Calvin began to see Khloe not as a wild card, but as a woman with a fierce intelligence and unyielding strength that challenged him in ways no one else dared. But as they grew closer, the secrets and lies that had brought them together threatened to tear them apart. For Khloe had begun to suspect there was more to this arrangement than Calvin had let on. And Calvin knew that the closer she got to the truth, the harder it would be to keep her in his life. By the 9th month of their arrangement, the lines between obligation and reality blurred beyond recognition. Khloe Daniels no longer knew where the act ended and where the truth began. Her relationship with Calvin Moretti had transformed into something she couldn't define, neither love nor hatred, neither trust nor complete distrust. But the closer they became, the clearer it was that something was wrong. Khloe first sensed it when Calvin began withdrawing. He was always busy, but now his absences stretched longer, his gaze distant even when they shared the same room. He spent hours locked in his office, emerging only to make perfunctory comments about upcoming events or logistics for their marriage. One evening, Khloe decided to confront him. "You've been acting strange," she said, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the penthouse. Calvin, seated on the couch with his laptop, barely looked up. "I'm always busy." "That's not strange." "It's not just that," she pressed, crossing her arms. "You've been avoiding me. What's going on?" He closed his laptop with a soft click and sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't get to decide what I should worry about. We're in this together, remember?" For a moment, his expression softened, a flicker of regret in his eyes. But then his walls came up again. "Khloe, drop it." Her jaw tightened, but she let it go, for now. The turning point came during a charity gala in honor of Calvin's late parents. Khloe had learned that the Morettis had been philanthropists before their untimely death in a plane crash, and Calvin had always taken great care to preserve their legacy. The ballroom was filled with the city's most influential figures, all raising glasses to toast the Moretti name. Khloe played her role impeccably, mingling with ease and deflecting the subtle barbs of judgment she had grown accustomed to. But as the evening wore on, she noticed Calvin slipping out of the room. Her curiosity piqued, she excused herself and followed him. She found him in the building's garden, leaning against a marble railing as he stared out into the night. His suit jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, and he clutched a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Are you hiding?" she asked, stepping into the cold night air. He didn't turn to face her. "Maybe." Khloe hesitated before approaching. "You've been off all night. Did something happen?" Calvin chuckled bitterly. "Isn't it obvious? This whole charade is exhausting." Her heart ached at the weariness in his voice. "Then why do it?" He turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically raw. "Because it's all I have left. My name, my reputation, it's all built on appearances. If I let it crumble, everything my parents worked for disappears." For the first time, Khloe saw the weight Calvin carried. He wasn't just a man consumed by ambition, he was haunted by the fear of failure, of tarnishing the legacy he had inherited. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "That's the thing, Khloe. I've always been alone. Even now." Khloe didn't realize how true those words were until a few weeks later, when she stumbled upon a file in Calvin's office. She had been looking for a book she'd left behind when she noticed the document on his desk. The heading caught her eye: Zenith Towers Contractual Negotiation. Her heart sank as she skimmed the contents. It detailed the terms of a massive real estate deal, one Calvin had mentioned in passing but never explained fully. And at the bottom of the document was a clause that made her stomach churn. In the event of marriage, all competing shares to be relinquished to Calvin Moretti upon the fulfillment of a 12-month contractual union. Khloe's hands trembled as she read the words again. The bet. The marriage. It wasn't just about optics, it was about control. Calvin's deal hinged on their arrangement, on convincing the world of their perfect union. She shoved the document back where she found it and left the office, her mind racing. When Calvin returned later that evening, she confronted him, her voice shaking with anger. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" He froze, his face betraying a flicker of panic before his mask slipped back into place. "What are you talking about?" She held up her phone, where she had taken a photo of the contract. "This. Your precious Zenith Towers. You didn't marry me because you needed a partner, you did it because you needed a pawn." His silence was damning. "Say something, Calvin," she demanded, her voice breaking. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," she snapped. "This was never about us. It was about your empire. Your legacy. Your damned pride." For the first time, Calvin's composure cracked. "You're right," he said, his voice rough. "It started as a deal. A bet. But it's not just that anymore." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Don't you dare try to twist this. I trusted you." "I know," he said, stepping closer, his voice pleading. "And I broke that trust. But somewhere along the way, you became more than just a part of the plan. You." "Stop," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I can't do this anymore." She turned and walked away, leaving Calvin standing in the middle of the penthouse, his world crumbling around him. The days that followed were a blur of silence. Khloe moved back to her Brooklyn apartment, retreating into the simplicity of her old life. Yet, she couldn't shake the memory of Calvin's voice, the vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes. Meanwhile, Calvin buried himself in his work, his empire running on autopilot as he grappled with the void Khloe's absence had left. Weeks turned into months, and as the year drew to a close, the terms of their agreement were nearly fulfilled. But neither of them felt victorious. On a snowy December evening, Khloe received a knock at her door. She opened it to find Calvin, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. "I came to apologize," he said simply. "For everything. For the lies, the manipulation. For taking you for granted." She crossed her arms, her heart pounding. "Why now?" "Because I don't want this to end like this," he said, his voice raw. "You were right, I treated this like a game. But you've changed me, Khloe. You made me see the world differently. And I can't lose that." Her breath caught. For a moment, she saw the man behind the mask, the man she had begun to care for. "Words aren't enough, Calvin," she said quietly. "If you want this to mean something, you'll have to prove it." He nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. "Then I will." As the snow fell around them, Khloe realized that their story was far from over. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't certain, but for the first time, it felt real.